Welcome to the Healing My Parts podcast, a podcast dedicated to educating and raising awareness about dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID. We are your hosts, the system behind Healing My Parts, which also includes parts that function as a therapist and leader in a mental health niche space. We'll be sharing tips and tools that have helped us and many others, while also sharing insights from our own journey of living with the condition. We'll also be hosting guests for conversations to help educate, dispel myths, and most especially help those living with dissociative identities and professionals who treat the condition. Thank you so much for tuning in. And now, let's get healing. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited about today's guest, who is the author of the new book, Bachelorx. Welcome, Skylar Lyralen Kaye. It's so lovely to have you here. And I wonder if you could just let listeners know a little bit about you, what you would like them to know before we dig into your amazing book.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. So I go by Skye, and my pronouns are they and they. I am an out, plural, gender fluid, trans fae. I'm an award-winning writer, actor, solo performer, slam poet, storyteller. And I just got off the water, and that can be said almost every day, like at any time. I've almost always just finished paddleboarding, which is liftoff. It's so wonderful.
I feel like you're living the life of my dreams.
In Portugal.
I also love the list of things that you do because I feel like that is so characteristically a system.
Yes.
Here are the many things that we can do and we do fairly well, which is such a beautiful thing. I'm curious a little bit. The book that you wrote opens with you being outed as plural on a date, right? And wondering if anyone would ever want you and then having a breakup 3 times. What made you decide that that moment would be the opening of your book?
Well, it's kind of classic to want a hook. And you want a hook that leads into what you're genuinely going to talk about. So I wanted a hook that led into dating. And I also wanted to show that I was very scared about dating. And I questioned not my own worth, but how other people would perceive my own worth. And then I had this experience of, this person saying to me, I don't know how you thought anyone would want you. And then I have to break up with her 3 times in order to make her go away, which is so ironic. And then the book goes back in time to the end of my marriage. And I didn't want the book to start there. Partly because I found in the development of the book, people were way too interested in my marriage. I'm like, the book isn't about my marriage.
That actually makes so much sense. How you actually introduce the reader to plurality isn't through a definition by any means. You kind of drop the reader right into the middle of it. And we notice that Micah, Kara, the angry kids show up and really speak for themselves. I'm just curious if you planned to write it that way, or did that form just kind of develop as you were laying the book out, knowing that you had a message for the world?
There were 2 things. So the first one with the main love story is, I'm Orpheus in the book, and it's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and I love using the mythopoetic. And I also wanted to flip that myth on its head a little bit. So I just wrote the last 200 pages of the book, which is the love story. And I was writing it because I wanted to understand what had happened in that love story in my life. I didn't understand. I was completely kind of blown away by the experience. And then I thought, if I really want to understand what happened, I have to write it through the point of view of who I really am, which is a plural person. So that was how I came to that. And then it happened. I wrote a memoir in 2006. And I wrote it as I wrote this one with my inner people speaking for themselves. So I had a prototype, right? I had done this before. And then when I started doing that, I excerpted the original memoir for the beginning. And then I realized that I wanted the story to be much more than the love story. And I got very inspired by recording on the page how my inner people relate to each other, which is the central meaning of my life. And then the book really, I got very excited. The book took off. Writing it became pure joy, you know.
I'm not completely finished with it yet, but the parts that I've been reading are so incredibly compelling and it flows so beautifully. As a system, you can feel your system working, stepping forward when it needs to, stepping back when it doesn't need to. And the voices they're really, really well done and amazing. You found out you were plural at 30, as I recall from the book, by handing a stuffed bear named, I have this right, Samuel, Samantha, Frederick, Ted, Teddy to a therapist who apparently missed the hint involved in that dynamic. And what did the years between that discovery and now look like for you? You know, just the texture of your life from this moment of I am a system giving this missed hint to my therapist to here I am today in my 60s with a very full life.
Yeah, there were a couple steps before that and a couple steps after that to really saying out loud, I am multiple. And that did happen the year that I turned 30. I would say that it started with coping, with knowing, like getting to know all my inner people, being hijacked by them at times, finding out that some of them hated me, and that they hated me because they carried trauma and I didn't, you know, so this kind of debt that I feel like I owe to those parts of me. And then the kind of texture of my whole life, I would say, is an ever expanding sense of humanity and meaning out of the sacred spiritual path of reaching to my own inner people, consistently learning how to be more loving and compassionate to them, which then led me to be more loving and compassionate in my life. And I always say the best work I did in my career came from what I learned from my system, from what everybody taught me about acceptance, about healing, about consent and collaboration and contracting. I used those things as a teacher, as a director, as a producer. I used what my system taught me about being human.
How did you remain open? You know, I'm just thinking in the beginning when people start to think about, oh, there is more than one in here. There can be a number of reactions, right? It feels surreal. People sometimes reject it. They don't want that to be the truth. They want parts to go away. It's not that often that people are like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't wait to get to know everybody. How did you remain open and able to persistently sort of coax parts forward to talk with you more, get to know each other, figure each other out?
I think in life and being plural, there's always more than one thing happening at a time. And so I had several parts of me that were just like, let me love you. And then I had parts of me that were like, is this even real? And I was specifically taught to doubt my own reality as a child and not to believe myself. So I was imprinted by that. And I had parts who were embarrassed and ashamed. So all of that was happening at the same time. And I think one of the gifts of plurality in internal family systems, and I always say, I think Dick Schwartz stole the big S self idea from Hinduism. I'm a yoga teacher, I studied it. So one of the gifts of plurality is that you can have contact with your big S self in a very pure way. And that, when I learned to let that lead, and I always say, I mean, this is an example, it's very, very personal, but I would have somebody say, you know, an inner person would say, I really hate you. And the big S self would answer, you really hate me. No attempt to change the reality, just restating with compassion and doing it over and over again, and the experience of how that transforms a part that has no reason to trust anyone on earth into trusting me. It was that experience of transformation and the ability to contact that force for light.
And I think so much about how angry parts, parts that feel abandoned, who feel like they have done so much for, because they have done so much for us, right? That's not really just a feeling, that's factual. Having someone inside who can be there and be that steady, loving presence, no matter what they think, feel, say, or do, can be, I think, really transformative for some really, really deeply hurt parts. And it sounds like you were able to do that really pretty intuitively and beautifully.
Yeah, I think that I started with, I had a teen, I mean, it's Micah. You know, Micah was like, I'm going to set some boundaries. This is unacceptable. and and that was interesting, and it was not negative. You know, there were little kids who felt protected by that, but it was not enough. You know, I really felt like until I found the ability to accept everybody exactly where they were, I couldn't really move forward into, you know, not only expanding humanity, expanding joy and awe.
Speaking of Micah, I feel like a lot of systems identify by having parts very similar to Micah. And as I recall, there were some very strong opinions about the dating process coming specifically from Micah.
Yes.
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 Well, what was it like when a part like that has really different needs and a very different urgency around things like intimacy than maybe you do as a whole system?
I think that from July of 2022 until January of 2024, I was out of balance. And it took quite a long time. I mean, you think about the core of the book is that of a 35-year marriage, 32 years were asexual and not by my choice. And when my sexuality opened up, it exploded. You know, I mean, there's, Micah says in the book, hey, telephone poles look good, you know? And I think it was initially both really fun for some, for the teenagers, and a lot of me just enjoys and loves Micah. And it was really scary for the kids and for the vulnerable parts. Are we going to be able to hold boundaries with other people with this much drive? And Micah did, especially, you know, there's one particular person I dated that Micah chose that was a very negative experience. She was hot, you know. But I think at the end of that experience, Kay says to Micah, listen, it's not all your fault. We all chose to stay in that marriage, and we are not sane after 32 years of deprivation. So Micah kind of carried the sexuality and carried the drive, and Micah's always fun. But all of us have responsibility in choosing to stay in something that, for all the many positive things about it, left us whacked, you know? And I feel a lot of tenderness for Micah for carrying the blame, you know, even though it wasn't very long until we all said, hey, you know, this isn't your fault. It was still, you know, it's hard.
I think it's a really beautiful moment when parts in the system can come together and communicate collectively, that caring and a release of blame for one part that's kind of, quote, taken the fall for the entire system. A lot of people feel really confused about the concept of system responsibility. I hear a lot of people who will say, why should I be responsible for something that other part did that I didn't have a say in when it was happening? Because maybe they don't have great internal communication in place yet. And I wonder if you would be able to talk a little bit about your experiences with the process of system responsibility and learning that the collective is really responsible for the collective, including when a part goes rogue.
Yes, that was drilled into me very early on by therapists. And on one hand, it was helpful. I'm the oldest of 6 children. I was always responsible for everything. So having somebody say, you are responsible, my system wide is like, okay, then I'm responsible. I think understanding that I couldn't say to people in my life, well, I'm not the one who did that. Like, that wasn't me. Because I did say that a couple times, and it made the people I loved very angry, It was you. You share a body. I think that what's hard about it is that when some of you or many of you really don't want to have done the thing that one person did, and that you feel shame and you feel remorse and you want credit for those feelings, I didn't mean it. I just found that it was better to say, okay, we did that, and then inside to work with what happened and what caused us to act in a way that didn't feel congruent with who we ultimately want to be.
Did you find that when you were able to come together, or many of you were able to come together internally to address a part that went rogue and did something that was misaligned with who you are as a total collective, that I'm trying to think of how I want to word this, that the collective communication with that part that had gone rogue was something that was pivotal in actually bringing you even closer together? Does that make sense?
Yes, and absolutely. Because I've been doing this for 36 years. And initially, it was a different discussion than it eventually became. And there was a lot of blame, and there was a lot of anger, and a lot of friction. And it took a long time I would just always rely on contracting. Okay, so what do you need to be safe enough so that you don't do that? In the end, in the early stages, that was what I did. And then I started to realize that my most wounded personalities wanted love and safety. And they started, the contract was so key for a good 30 years. And they started to say, you haven't given us what you agreed to on the contract, and we're going to act out, and we're not going to be able to stop ourselves unless you show up the way you promised to. And I started to understand that they didn't want to do what they did either. And again, that comes down to, it really is the responsibility of all of us to take care of each other. And sometimes I would say, like, the healers get overwhelmed or get tired and let people down, and then they act out. Well, whose responsibility is the acting out? It's both the responsibility of the personality who acted out and for the one who didn't show up and do their part.
That is so powerful. And I think that really brings a deeper understanding for a lot of people who feel really confused about that dynamic. Because you can understand it. We've been in it. I have, right, where a part does something that you're like, oh, crap, that's not exactly the way I wanted that to go.
Right.
And there is, this desire to almost be like, that wasn't me. And yet it came out of this mouth, this body, etc. So to somebody else, clearly we're responsible for it. So that's a really understandable desire. But it really does make a huge difference when you start getting to that place that you just talked about, where it's like that part is acting out because it's not getting something that it needs, which means somebody else or a lot of other folks inside are not showing up the way that they need to. Because we are really all in this together, whether we want to be or not, we are.
Yeah.
And we can fight against it. Or, I know lots of folks are not necessarily DBT fans, but I think when Marsha Linehan talks about the way out of hell is essentially radical acceptance, your life is a lot easier when you say, this is what it is. So how am I going to work with it? I might not have caused all of my problems, but I got to solve them.
Right.
You also talk about when you meet a potential partner, needing to talk about being plural with them. When you first started doing that, what was a predominant emotion for you? Were you really scared? Was it mostly anxiety? Were you frustrated?
It's a really interesting juxtaposition to be essentially proud of being plural, which I am, which we all are. We're proud of each other. Being plural as an identity. I don't see it as a diagnosis. It's my life. And to recognize there is stigma, judgment, oppression, and potential rejection for something I love about myself, which happens to be a very big trigger for me when someone rejects me for my good qualities. Like, that is
Fair.
it's particularly hard. So I'm thinking about, there's the second person that I dated, and before me, she dated a therapist who works with non-binary and trans teens. And so I gave her a postcard for my web series in which I play a plural person. And she assumed that I was playing myself, which I both was and was not. It was a fictional character, but very related. I wrote it. So, and the woman I was dating told me, she confronted me and said, my ex said, what's it like to date a multiple? And I said, who's dating a multiple? Because I hadn't come out. And I had a moment of, I knew that I could totally get away with saying that I'm that good an actor. I'm such a good actor, I can play a plural person and play all their parts. So I knew that I could say that, and I thought that has no integrity. And okay, I'm going to come out, and if she rejects me, her loss. Like, I very much had a moment of, I'm going to say what's true, and I'm going to say it without shame because that's how I really feel. And I had a moment of being free of that fear of rejection and judgment. So that was the first time that I came out to somebody. I was outed. And the second time I came out because I had mentored a lot of young actors, and they all knew I was plural, and they all called me you all, which I deeply love. And it was very kind of them to always say, we see you, we see you. So I came out to this other person, and their response was exactly what you would want. Being plural is creative. It's an incredible way to survive. You're brilliant. I actually knew another plural person. I very much admired them. So that's a like, yoo-hoo, right? Thank whatever, whoever. Except that given who this person is and was, I always had this doubt. Are you saying that because it's what you think you should say? Are you saying that because you know that's what all of me wants to hear? Or do you really mean it? So and I think that is something that everybody is different, and you have to cope with coming out to people differently. Mostly, coming out to people has been okay. And the last two people I dated, I decided I was not going to come out to them until I knew that I was serious about the relationship, and I was never serious enough to tell them. I just thought it's always a big deal. It's never like, oh, I've known, not with people my age. Oh, I've known, like when I come out to people in their 20s and 30s, oh yeah, I've got like 6 plural friends, no big deal. You come out to somebody in their 50s and 60s, they're like, are you like Sybil? So,
Yeah.
so it's a big deal. And sometimes it's just like being queer. I don't have the energy for that today. And I have the right to not have the energy. And I was very glad I didn't come out to either of those people. Now, however, it's on my website. You Google my name, and I'm dating somebody now. We're going on our second date tomorrow. And I'm waiting for her to say, so what's the plurality? you know?
What is the you all?
Right, exactly.
I mean, when you were talking about not having the energy, right, that makes so much sense to me for so many different reasons. What do you think that single people, meaning singlets or singletons, people who aren't plural, really kind of fundamentally struggle to understand about what dating costs a system?
The first thing is that if you're a system, if you identify as being plural because you come from trauma, the trauma is not light, right? It's complex. In my case, it lasted for 20 years. So the triggers that people have around dating, around abandonment, about overwhelm, attachment, all of those things are harder. All of those things are experienced. They cut more deeply, and therefore it's harder to regulate them. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, while you're doing all that regulation around dating to try to be healthy and assert yourself, you also are having to deal with oppression, stigma, and misunderstanding about this identity. And that's very stressful. I think that people who are in the IFS community are going to do a better job of understanding both about the regulation and plurality. I'm not sure that they will fully get the ableism and the bias towards neurotypical people, and the idea that if you're not neurotypical, you're somehow less worthy, which is just not true.
In some ways, I've heard a lot of systems, and I've even spoken about it as well, that IFS, while categorically beautiful in its own right, in many ways has conflated what it's like to be a plural person, where people conflate the parts of someone who's single with this kind of unlimited access to their parts of selves versus what it's like to be plural, or a lot more differentiated and sometimes highly compartmentalized, where you don't know who's living in the next room to you in the inner world. Have you run into any difficulty with people who understand IFS intimately and use it a lot, where they misunderstand you as a system as a result because the parts language has been conflated?
It's interesting. I was in my marriage, my 35-year marriage, my ex did a ton of IFS work. And when I discovered that I was plural, they had plural envy. And they really wanted to do the kind of therapy that I did. And then IFS was, a magical mystery tour for them. But they never achieved the kind of clarity that I have around my inner people. So it's actually the opposite. They had a lot of fog and a lot of difficulty finding their parts. And mine are like jumping up and down saying, my turn, my turn, my turn. So I've always been I've been very co-conscious, and that has to do with the systemic awfulness of how I was raised. So I know that there are plural people who, the classic wake up in Texas and don't know how they got there, right? And I didn't have that experience. I think that I love that IFS normalizes plurality, and I don't like that in some ways it minimizes it for us.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no perfect modality, honestly. I was just curious because you had mentioned it a couple of times, and I know people have all sorts of different feelings about it. I'm actually trained in it and I have a healthy appreciation for it. And when I work with clients, I use parts of it, I adapt it pretty heavily. But it's interesting because I find people have lots of different experiences. Folks who are clinicians who are trained in it believe that because they've done their own parts work, they understand intimately what it's like to be a plural person. And I have found that to be categorically false across the board, right? And, systems who feel sometimes minimized by the categories and the structure of IFS itself, and other systems who, it sounds like you who find it incredibly beneficial. And so I like to be able to kind of show all those sides when I can, so that it's not this is good, this is bad. It's see if it works for you, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Dick Schwartz endorsed my book, and it's the third project of mine that he endorsed. He's an incredibly generous man, and it meant a lot to me that he did that. I feel like it's helpful to have many different systems of thought and ways of looking at things. So I don't want to be limited to managers, firefighters, exiles. I think there's many other categories. And I also think, and Dick, I think, came around to this, that the big S self, more and more of me becomes like my big S self.
Yeah. I was lucky when I did some of my training. I did it in 2008 on the Cape, and Dick Schwartz was the trainer. Like I don't even know if you can do that anymore, but I was really lucky in that way. And I remember thinking what an incredibly open spiritual man he was. It did not surprise me. I listened to the podcast episode that Jamie Marriage did on Therapy Chat with Dick, and he talked a lot about basically IFS and DID, and he was talking about self as self energy and the more spiritual higher self perspective you had mentioned. He mentioned that he believes every part, or in his experience, he said when he directly accesses parts in a DID system, every part has their own self energy. Do you find that in your system as well?
I do. I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's something that the healers and me say to everybody, we're all sacred.
Oh, I love that.
It's,
It's true.
it's true.
It's very true. You had mentioned your marriage, which was 35 years long, as I recall, and you describe it as a conscious people brewing machine, but also as genuinely over. And how do you hold both of those things as true at the same time as a system?
I have known Toby for 43 years, and we related in so many different ways and on so many different levels that how I hold it and how I integrate that understanding is an ongoing process. And there are cycles of grief about letting go of somebody I thought I was going to grow old and die with. There's intense relief. There's more and more understanding of both how lucky I was that I chose them in my 20s, and also how they held me back and I enabled them. So there's just so many levels of humanity to understand in this marriage. I think the more I hold all of it, the bigger a person I become. I learned how to forgive in this marriage, and believe me, I was not a forgiving person. There's a joke about Pisces that we'll walk a mile to get our feelings hurt and then hold a grudge for the rest of our lives.
I've never heard that, but that's great.
It was a very appropriate description of me, and I loved this person so much that I learned to forgive. And we used to have this thing where we would say, can I just have a do-over? I really screwed that up. Can I just get a do-over? I'm sorry, I just want a do-over. Like no repair, no big processing. Let me just try that again. And I think that's an amazing thing to have in a relationship. I didn't learn that growing up, you know?
Nobody told me that.
Yeah, that you could even do that. And I do feel that, now it's been a little over 4 years since I left, and the marriage would not be congruent with who I am. And I have grown more from leaving than I ever would have from staying. And that's also true for Toby.
That just reminds me of a book that I had read called Emmanuel's Books. And he is talking about how we stay in relationships, sometimes out of obligation. And he was answering the question of a person who felt really obligated to be in this relationship that genuinely wasn't good for the person, but they were so worried about their partner if they were to leave, and felt like I made this commitment and I made this vow to this person to be with them no matter what. And Emmanuel said, how do you know you're not holding them back from discovering their wings where they can really fly and open into their potential themselves? And I think there is something that is sometimes the most painful things that we go through can open up the greatest potential in our hearts and souls. And it just reminded me of that when you shared that about the breakup of your relationship and the ways in which you have both grown.
It's really interesting because the thing that I have recently learned, like in the last month, my inner kids had such a profound relationship to Toby. And that was the core in some ways. Initially, we just really wanted to parent each other and give each other what we had never had. I always say, great recipe for volatility. We had to work through that. But I finally, there's a thing in my system because I was so under-mothered that I always wanted a mom. And a lot of me has been embarrassed and sees that as very dangerous. Like I have said, I would sell my soul for a bucket of nurturing. And I've recently said to the kids, okay, you want a mom. We've done all this mother work and you still want a mom. So let's take every day 5 to 15 minutes, first thing in the morning, and you just get to tell us all how you want a mom. No judgment. And I think it's the biggest step to healing my kids I've ever taken. Every single part, no matter what they wants what they want for a reason, and they can't grow until they're heard and seen. That's like, and I've known that with everybody else. Why did I not know it with my very, very little kids,
Sometimes I think those very, very little kids kind of tap into our deepest pain.
Yeah.
That incredible loneliness of being abandoned on multiple different levels when you're so traumatized and hurt that young.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I don't know, I think we talk about it, but we don't. That feeling of incredible loneliness while we're holding that compassionate space for our inner children, and we are kind of mothering them in those moments, but we still never had that at the same time. So it's that longing that it's hard.
Yeah. And I think everybody has the wound, for me, it's the mother wound. And it's part of why I love paddleboarding. I am getting constantly mothered by Gaia when I paddleboard, when I hike, when I do earthing. And that wound may never completely heal. And the wound can lead you to your greatest self-destruction. It can also lead you to your greatest evolution and your greatest connection to other human beings. You don't want to just connect wound to wound, but it's a powerful connection when you do that and you have health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to unpack there,
Yeah.
Speaking of kids, you have a chapter called Kids Fighting that is a really interesting dialogue to read. And there's a place where Yuri spills onto the page kind of with multiple fonts and voices all at the same time. And it's kind of this combination of chaotic and tender and so deeply real. And I wonder what it was like for you to just write through that process of, somebody's falling for someone and the whole system is not remotely unanimous about it.
No, we were the opposite of you. That caused so much conflict and different conflicts over, I always say, the longest 3 months in my life. And just to, say, I mean, Orpheus and Eurydice, it's a tragedy, and Eurydice dies in the myth. And my Eurydice showed up with a lump in her breast and a genetic heart anomaly. So I was terrified she was going to die. When the kids, I was writing it after the fact, and I was going back in memory and consciousness. And when I was writing it, I thought, oh, the kids really wanted her to be their mother. They wanted to please her. That was part of the limerence, the falling for. And Micah is trying to make sense of it, because I think angry kids were picking on Kara partly because Kara didn't like Eurydice, and Kara always tells the truth and is very outspoken, and Eurydice wanted the kids not to tell people anything. So for me writing it, I just felt this heartbreak for my own kids and also for all of me, because I knew as it was happening that this was not a good sign. And I couldn't stop the train. It was a runaway train.
So human.
Yeah.
There's so much humanity, throughout your writing and throughout the book itself. And there's a really, really poignant part too, where girl child in that same chapter says something about believing that maybe Yuri is afraid that they were never worth loving, but that girl child thinks I might be in love with her a lot, I think was the line, right? The young part seeing that so clearly before the adults do. Are you finding that throughout your system that the younger parts have that perception frequently before the older parts do? And does that surprise you at all?
I value the perceptions of everybody. And I'm going to use a different example that is not in the book, but, Toby is trans mask, and at one point was trying to figure out, like, are they a trans man? Are they non-binary? Do they want to transition? And I was in therapy, and my kids, especially Kara, were like, I'm not gay. How can I be gay? Toby is a boy. I have a boyfriend. I'm not gay. And of course, I'm this totally out gay activist. And, there's a piece of education, like, okay, that's probably some internalized homophobia. The kids grew up in the 60s in Ohio. But I was more completely overwhelmed by how clear my inner kids were about Toby's gender. And they were 100% accurate. And throughout the marriage, the things, when the kids made a pronouncement about Toby, sometimes in couples therapy, and the therapist would say, like, out of the mouths of babes, because it was always true. Like, the kids had Toby down. So I value that. And I think I have learned so much about Girl Child. And I think Girl Child saw Eurydice with utter clarity. And Girl Child's role in my life and in my system is a mirror to some of Yuri's life and role. We're both oldest children from Catholic families, basically raised their families and never had a childhood. And when Girl Child said, I think I'm in love with her a lot, it was seeing somebody. like really seeing somebody and saying, I am you, I am like you. And that was true for Girl Child. In a way, it was never going to be true for Micah or for Kara or for Kay. And it was so sweet. And it also eventually led me to understand how lonely Girl Child was for someone that they could talk to and relate to, who would maybe understand what her role had been, you know?
It's so deeply moving to read it, especially as a system where you can relate different parts of your own system to different things that you describe or various dynamics. And which leads me to one that I'm super curious about. Micah is really described as a protector, carries the kids basically starting the journey out, doesn't get credit for grades or poems, but really kept everyone alive in many different parts of your life, it sounds like. What's it been like to not just proverbially, but literally give him the page and the all caps to speak for himself?
Well, he picked the all caps.
That does not surprise me.
I think the big difference in giving Micah so much of the stage, I mean, I think in some ways this is Micah's book. And the connections and the transformations within my system are Micah and George transform with each other. Micah and Girl Child transform with each other. Micah and Kay, especially Micah listening more to Kay, is a transformation. I think Micah has always been very well loved in my system because my inner kids adore him. He's like the big brother that you would always want, who's always going to fight for you, who's going to never let even inner people be mean to you. You know, Micah is worth loving, you know. What has been amazing is the response of other people, plural people and people who aren't plural. Everybody loves Micah. And I've written in my work, I have other characters where I'm using Micah, and often people are like, could you be a little less blunt? And so confrontational. What is the problem with that character? No, I don't want to play that character. And and every time I was shocked. I was like, that's like one of my favorite parts of me. Okay. So this time, Micah has been celebrated by, I think, every reviewer, by all my friends. And, you know, people are like, can I hang out with Micah? Can I go paddleboarding with Micah?
I got sent the couple-minute clip of Micah speaking. I think he said like 6 words and I loved him. I can't wait to talk to him. He's so witty and so smart and so many things. And you can tell that in literally like 2 minutes.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I bet this has to feel really good, especially given the prior experiences that you had where somebody's like, I don't think I want to play that part. It's too blunt. But wow, when you hear Micah, there's a feeling that's so palpable that you just can't not feel affection to somebody you've never even met yet.
I think with Micah that what people missed in other parts of, you know, my fictional work is that Micah is made of love. Swears like a truck driver, you know, loves to cause trouble, loves to state the obvious, is not afraid of making anybody uncomfortable, and would fight to the death to keep anybody from being hurt.
What's not to love, seriously? You mentioned, as a therapist, and half of the listenership are therapists who are interested in treating folks who are plural and helping them thrive in the world. You have had about 17 therapists by your count, I believe,
Yeah.
and 4 of those 17 were helpful. What do those 4 do differently? Trust me when I say everybody listening wants to know.
They were all client-centered. So the modalities were different and all the modalities were helpful. I loved them. There was The first one was a yoga therapist, and she worked to get all of us to, now I know, to hear Kay very clearly, because Kay holds my intuition. So it was all focused on, I'm not going to give you advice. I'm not really going to lead you or recommend you books. I'm just going to help you to find your inner knowing. So that's totally client-centered. I was 29 years old in the first year of sobriety, and that was my foundation, and I don't think I would have made it through the rest of my healing without it. Because I got really bad therapy, but I had this reference point of the knowing is in me, I just have to find it. So I think that teaching clients how to find their own resources is key to successful therapy. And I say this, a lot of therapies have gone this way. We have feminist therapy, and I think it started there with a different model than, Freud and the more patriarchal models. But I discovered I was multiple in 1990. And it was very much psychodynamic transference work. And that makes the therapist and the therapeutic relationship the center of the therapy, and therapy is your resource. That was an incredibly unsafe therapy for me. I mean, I didn't have a good therapist, but it was never going to be what I needed to feel safe in the world. The first safety starts with being safe with yourself.
At some point, you talk about brain spotting as being a pivot point for you all. What made that different from some of the other things that you had tried with your system before?
Since we were talking about therapy, I'll say it is a lot easier to work with me now than it was 36 years ago. So if it's the right match with a therapist, I am motivated. I want to collaborate. I'm honest. I have a lot of self-knowledge. So I brought that, and then I found two. This was at a time where no one could find a therapist, let alone a brain spotting therapist. I found two, and I talk about both of them in the book. I don't know if other people find this with EMDR, because brain spotting is a cousin to EMDR. The work I did with brain spotting actually eliminated triggers. So I had an asexual marriage with an asexual partner. My side of that was a lot of sexual trauma and wondering if I could ever be intimate and not get triggered and dissociate. And that I was terrified about that. And then I did brain spotting, and there's a point in the book where I'm talking about I got a massage from a guy, and he was massaging my glutes, and I was like, wow, that feels really good. Wait, that feels good? Because that would make me leave my body anytime in the 61 years before that. And then when I was able to date and become sexual with people, I experienced being present for the very first time. I brought a lot of, I had set the stage with all the other healing. Brain spotting took me over the finish line. I could not believe that I was able in this lifetime to experience what other people experience without having to do all that work. But I think that is the pivotal point for me, is that brain spotting reduced traumatic charge more quickly and more effectively than any other therapy. And there's plenty of therapy models that I love, but that's what brain spotting offered me.
That's fantastic. That's a huge win.
Yeah.
And I think will make lots of folks interested in exploring. There's many folks that may not have heard about brain spotting who may now look into it, may also be really hopeful for them as well. You had mentioned loving a lot of modalities. Are there other ones that come to mind that you feel like have been really helpful for you as a system?
Somatic experiencing, which is also about creating new neural pathways in the brain. Until somatic experiencing, I would go to therapy, and most of the time I would have a hangover afterwards. So I would feel traumatized or upset, and I would go to somatic experiencing, and sometimes I would bring something that triggered me in daily life. I was teaching acting then. I remember I had a really hard class, like 12 people, 6 of them were ACOAs, 1 was a rape survivor, and 2 were incest survivors. And I'm teaching them how to open up. I mean, it was very delicate work, and sometimes they had transference towards me. And I'm an acting teacher, not a therapist at this point. And I brought that to somatic experiencing, and you're always doing resourcing. You're titrating between a resource, a positive image, a fantasy, a protector in the outside world, an image, and the other experience that's hard. Every session, except for like 2, I left feeling better. And I felt better the whole week. So it was just this, all right, I've got a problem and I'm going to feel better, you know? I would say also body-centered work is very hard in the beginning because your body holds all your trauma. And if you do yoga or authentic movement or some things that really are going to open up your physical experience, it can be overwhelming and really traumatizing. Like, that's why we have trauma-informed yoga. However, I studied acting. I have an MFA from Sarah Lawrence, and that's 30 hours of breath, body, spontaneity, connection, and a week for 2 years. And I would say anything that gets you in your body is going to give you more life. And it's hard, because you have to lean into whatever comes up. But all the body modalities are so life-giving.
So hard for folks, depending on where they're at, right, in their process. It's terrifying to lean into and be present in essentially the vehicle that was hurt so terribly.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt that way for years. Like, I don't want this thing. This is how they got to me.
But what a reclamation.
Yeah.
That's so powerful. When you think about healing now, because our entire life we're always growing and expanding and changing. When you think about healing now versus healing when you were, say, in your late 20s, early 30s, how would you characterize the differences?
Well, it's hugely different because I had such a crisis. I mean, I was in crisis for 3 years, and it was a very scary time. I didn't sleep. I had 10, 15 flashbacks a day for about a year. So I don't experience healing as a crisis anymore. And when, dating is like pouring Miracle Grow on everything you don't want to see about yourself. All your patterns are going to show up. Oh, I thought I fixed that. Nope, didn't. But even in the triggering and the reenactments of dating, I got really screwed up, and I did 8 brain spotting sessions in 2 weeks, and then I just was back to normal grief. That's what it's like in my 60s. I know what to do. I can recalibrate. I can come back to balance. And I would say that we have a default in us, right? We all have a default. What's like one of my defaults is taking responsibility. Another default is feeling everybody's feelings for them, So in long-term healing, you get to build another default. And my system is accustomed to balance. I fall out of balance, but I come back. So in late stage healing, coming back to balance is easier. I know where it is, I know how to find it, and I know what to do. And when I don't, I know how to ask for help in a way that I had no idea in my 20s and 30s. That was when I was learning how to ask for help.
So much appreciation for that. When you look at your book and you think about other systems who are going to be reading your book, what feeling do you want them to take away?
The humble gratitude of what it's like to fall in love with yourselves.
It's gorgeous. That's so gorgeous. Is there anything that you would love to say directly to inner parts of systems that are currently listening, along with whoever the fronting personality might be currently?
I'm going to say this for many different parts of me. We see you and we hear you, and none of you are alone. And all of you deserve to be loved, and all of you are capable of healing.
Anything that you would like to say directly to various providers, therapists out there listening?
The activist parts of me would say, please question the medical industrial complex. And diagnosis is helpful for being able to get clear on the lay of the land. It is then ever after helpful to teach people, whoever they are, whatever form they show up in, there's nothing wrong with them. They're good enough.
It's beautiful. We will make sure there are links in the show notes, your website, how to find you, where to get your book, which is amazing. And on behalf of all of the listenership and my entire system, thank you so very much for this conversation today. This has been so beautiful. You're so generous.
Oh, thank you. I have so enjoyed it. I was really looking forward to it, and it's every bit as good as I hoped.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. I absolutely loved this conversation. I think the role of love in healing honestly just can't be overstated. And Skye's story is really such a beautiful example of what's possible when our insiders begin to trust one another and they come together and start collaborating and respecting each other. So, we're going to link Skye's book, website, and Substack in the show notes for you so that you all can continue exploring their work. We encourage you to do that. And before we head out, a little exciting news on our end. Registration is now open for our live 90-minute workshop, Building and Using Your Inner World, Practical Tools for Making It Work for You, where together we're going to be exploring practical ways to build and use your inner world to support your communication, cooperation, daily life, and your healing. For our system, it has been absolutely pivotal in moving our healing forward and helping our daily life go much more smoothly, which we are super grateful for. And it has been tremendously helpful for our clients also. And for folks who might be newer to their diagnosis, this is a great way of getting to know more about your system mates as well. And while the workshop is designed for systems, it's a great resource for therapists who want to bring these ideas into their clinical work for their clients as well. So you can learn more about that and register at healingmyparts.org and just click on the live workshops in the menu. We can link it below as well. So until next time, take really good care of yourselves and let's keep healing. Thank you for tuning in. You can find our blog on Substack at healingmyparts.substack.com and on Instagram at healingmyparts. Just a disclaimer, any information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for professional therapy or behavioral health care, nor does listening to the podcast constitute a therapist-client relationship. Please be sure to take extra good care of you. And until next time, keep healing and thriving.